The deed landed on the table with a sound like a gunshot. Letitia Reed did not flinch. She stood perfectly straight in the doorway of the Harlan County Land Office, her dark eyes fixed on the man who had just slammed 3 separate sets of paperwork onto the registrar's desk with enough force to rattle the inkwells. Dust from the trail still clung to her dark green riding coat. Her hair, the color of winter wheat, was pinned back severely, but a few strands had come loose in the wind, and she had not bothered to fix them. She had ridden 40 miles in 2 days. She was not thinking about her hair. "You filed this claim." Amos Breck's voice was low and flat, the voice of a man accustomed to making threats that sounded like statements of fact. He was not a lawman. He was something worse than a lawman in this part of Kansas in the year 1878. He was the man who owned the lawman. "I did," Letitia said. "You filed it once, I pulled it." Breck pointed at the registrar, a thin man named Culver who was currently examining the floor tiles with tremendous interest. "He told me that himself." "He told you what you paid him to tell you," Letitia said. Her voice was steady. That steadiness had cost her something. She could feel the tremor behind her ribs, but she had learned, in the years since her father's death and the years since her marriage to a man who did not deserve her, that steadiness was its own form of power. "I filed the claim in Harlan County. I filed a duplicate in Morris County. I filed a third duplicate in Pawnee County, with a notarized copy sent to the federal land office in Topeka." She set her satchel on the chair beside the door with a deliberate quietness that was somehow louder than anything Breck had done. "You would have needed to corrupt 4 separate registrars and intercept a federal mail courier. I did not think you would do all 4. I was right." The silence that followed was the kind that had weight and temperature. Amos Breck stared at her. The 2 men flanking him, both armed, both wearing the particular expression of hired muscle that has just realized the assignment is more complicated than described, exchanged a glance. And in the doorway behind Letitia, leaning against the frame with his arms crossed and a look on his face that she could not quite decipher, was Clark Trask. She had not known he was there. She had not known he was watching. And the look on his face, the look she would only later understand as the moment a man stops seeing what he expected to see and starts seeing something entirely new, would change everything between them. But that was now. To understand how they had arrived here, you had to go back 8 weeks. You had to go back to the beginning of a story that began, like most true stories do, not with a dramatic confrontation but with a cold morning and a broken fence, and a woman who had learned to read the land the way other people read books. The spring of 1878 had come late to that stretch of central Kansas, and when it came hard, with storms that rolled in off the flats like God was rearranging furniture. The Homestead Act of 1862 had opened up this land to claimants willing to work it for 5 years, improve it, live on it, breathe their ambitions into the soil. Letitia Reed had been doing exactly that on her 160 acres since the spring of 1875, and she had 19 months left on her proving-up period when the fence line on her north quarter came down the 3rd time in as many weeks. The first time, she had thought it was wind. The second time, she had thought it was a stray bull from the Henderson Ranch 2 miles east. The third time, she got down on her knees in the mud and examined the posts with her hands, and she found what she had been afraid to find. The wood had not rotted. It had not been pushed by an animal. The fibers at the break were compressed in a very specific pattern that she recognized from the surveying work she had done with her father, who had been one of the most respected land surveyors in Ohio before drink and bad luck had brought the family west. The posts had been struck, repeatedly, from a specific angle, by someone who understood how to bring down a fence post in a way that was meant to look like weather or animals. Letitia sat back on her heels in the mud and looked out across her land, at the winter wheat just coming up green in the south field, at the cabin she had built with her own hands and the hands of 2 hired men over the course of one brutal summer, at the creek that ran through the lower quarter, and made this particular 160 acres worth fighting over. She had known, in the way that people who pay attention always know things before they can prove them, that this was coming. She had known it since the day Amos Breck had ridden up her front lane with his hat pushed back on his head, and that particular smile on his face, the smile of a man who has already decided the outcome of a conversation before he begins it. He had offered her $200 for the land. She had explained, politely, that the land was not for sale. He had smiled wider and ridden away, and the quality of that smile had told her everything she needed to know about what was coming next. What she had not known, as she knelt in the mud examining her broken fence, was that she was being watched from the ridge line to the north, and that the man watching her was not Breck's man. Clark Trask had ridden into Harlan County 6 days earlier with nothing to recommend him except a horse, a reputation he was trying to outrun, and the kind of quiet competence that men acquire when they have survived things they would prefer not to talk about. He was 31 years old. He had been a Texas Ranger for 3 years in the early part of the decade, and before that something less respectable, and the reasons he had left the Rangers were complicated in ways he kept to himself. He had a scar along his left jaw that people occasionally asked about, and that he occasionally told the truth about, which was that he had gotten it in a knife fight in Abilene over a card game that had not been worth the trouble. He was not, by any reasonable definition, a settled man. He moved, he worked where work was available, he kept his belongings to what fit in his saddlebags, and he had a talent for reading landscapes, both the geographical kind and the human kind, that had kept him alive through situations that should have killed him. He had come to Harlan County because a man named Ferris, who had once owed him a considerable favor, had mentioned that there was work to be had with a rancher named Gideon Walsh, who was trying to run cattle on a stretch of land north of the creek. He had not yet presented himself to Walsh. He was cautious by nature and by training, and he liked to understand the lay of a place before he committed himself to any piece of it. So he had spent the better part of a week riding the country, talking to people in town, eating his meals at the back table of the Prairie Dog Saloon, and listening. What he heard, once you stripped away the noise, was a story about power and land and a woman who was in the way. The woman had a name that people said with varying degrees of respect and wariness. Letitia Reed, widow, homesteader, filed in the spring of '75, running wheat and a kitchen garden and 20 head of cattle on 160 acres that sat directly between Amos Breck's existing holdings to the west and the creek that Breck needed to expand his operation to the east. She would not sell. Breck, who was not accustomed to the word no, and who had the money and the connections to make that word expensive, had begun making things difficult for her in the quiet, deniable ways that powerful men make things difficult for people who cannot easily fight back. Clark Trask had been listening to this story from the back table of the Prairie Dog, and he had been thinking about it in a way that he had not yet entirely examined, when he rode out the next morning to look at the creek and found himself on the ridge above the north quarter of Letitia Reed's homestead. He saw her in the mud examining the fence. He watched her work through it systematically, the way a person works through a problem they have already committed to solving. She was thorough. She was methodical. She did not look afraid, though she had every reason to be afraid. After a long moment she sat back on her heels and stared out over her land with an expression that he recognized, not despair, not resignation, but calculation. The expression of someone who is deciding what to do next. He rode down from the ridge without entirely deciding to. She heard him coming before she saw him, which told him something about her alertness, because the ground was soft from rain and he had been riding quietly. She was on her feet and turned to face him before he reached her, and her right hand was near the rifle scabbard on the saddle of the bay horse standing a few feet away. He appreciated that. He stopped his horse well back and raised a hand in a gesture that meant, across all the languages of the frontier, that he was not here for trouble. "Morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. Her eyes moved over him with the same methodical thoroughness she had applied to the fence posts. He had the odd sensation of being assessed and catalogued. "You're the man who's been riding the ridge for the past 3 days." He blinked. "I've been careful." "I know," she said. "The glint off your rifle barrel the first morning. The horse prints on the north slope the second morning. The fact that you waited until I was in sight before you came down this morning tells me you're not unfriendly, but the 3 days of watching without introducing yourself tells me you're careful." She tilted her head slightly. "Which means you're either trouble that's smart enough to be patient, or you're a man who's still making up his mind about something." Clark Trask sat on his horse and looked at Letitia Reed for a moment that stretched out longer than he intended. "The second one," he said finally. Something shifted in her expression. Not softness exactly. More like the adjustment a person makes when they have revised an estimate. "Then you'd better come have coffee," she said, "and tell me what you're making up your mind about." He tied his horse to the fence post that was still standing and followed her toward the cabin. The cabin was a revelation. Not because it was fancy, it was not fancy. It was a single room of solid cottonwood logs with a sleeping loft and a porch that faced east to catch the morning sun, but because of what was in it. One entire wall was covered in a hand-drawn survey map of extraordinary detail, marking not just the boundaries of her own homestead, but every neighboring claim, the creek's exact course as it meandered through the quarter sections, the depth markings she had taken at 3 points using a calibrated rod and string, and a series of notations in a precise, small hand that indicated water rights precedents according to Kansas territorial law. On the table, beside the coffee pot, was a copy of the General Land Office regulations, extensively annotated in pencil. On the shelf above the window was a set of surveying instruments, including a transit level, a measuring chain, and a field notebook of the kind that professional surveyors used. Clark Trask stood in the middle of this room and understood several things at once. "You're a surveyor," he said. "My father trained me," she said, pouring coffee into a tin cup and handing it to him. "I was his assistant for 6 years before we came west. I have his instruments and his field books and most of his knowledge." She sat down across the table from him. "Now, you've been looking at this county. What have you heard about Amos Breck?" It was not the conversation he had expected to have. But Clark Trask sat down and told her what he had heard, and she listened with the focused attention of a person who is cross-referencing incoming information against a mental map they have been building for some time. And by the time the coffee was finished, they had covered Breck's land holdings, his connections to 2 of the 3 county commissioners, the fact that Registrar Culver had a gambling debt that Breck was known to hold, and the particular vulnerability of Letitia's homestead claim given the time remaining on her proving-up period. 5 years from initial filing, she said. "I filed March 14th, 75. I have until March 14th, 80. 19 months. "Long time for Breck to make trouble," Clark said. "Yes." She looked at her map. "He does not need to evict me or buy me out. He only needs to make me fail to meet the improvement requirements, or to manufacture a legal challenge to my original filing that ties up the claim in dispute until I miss the deadline." She paused. "The fence is part of the second strategy. If he can damage my improvements significantly enough, he can argue before the county that I have not maintained the claim in good standing." Clark set down his coffee cup. "You've thought this through." "I've been thinking about nothing else for 3 months," she said, with a dry quality to her voice that was not quite humor but was related to it. "The fence is repairable. The legal challenge is the real threat. Culver has already told Breck that my original filing has an irregularity in the meets and bounds description." She turned the field notebook toward him, open to a page dense with measurements and calculations. "It does not have an irregularity. I surveyed this land myself before I filed. The measurements are correct to within half a chain. But Culver's word against mine, in a county where Breck owns 2 of 3 commissioners, is not a contest I can win." Clark looked at the notebook. The work was meticulous. He had done enough land work in his time with the rangers to recognize the precision of it. "So what's your plan?" She looked at him levelly. "I'm still deciding how much of that to tell a man I met 40 minutes ago." He felt a corner of his mouth lift in what might have been a smile. "Fair enough. Tell me why you're here," she said. "Who sent you?" "A man named Ferris. He arranged work for me with Gideon Walsh." Her expression changed, subtly but unmistakably. "Walsh is north of the creek. Walsh has a grazing agreement with Breck. I didn't know that when I agreed to come. And now that you know it." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind moved through the new wheat, and the sound was like a very distant conversation. "Now I'm making up my mind," he said. It was an echo of what he had said on horseback, and she caught it, and he saw the corner of her mouth move in what was almost a smile. "Then come back when you have," she said. "If you decide you're not Walsh's man and not Breck's man, I might have use for someone who can ride and shoot and who knows how to keep his own counsel." He stood, picked up his hat, and turned to go. Then he stopped. "The fence posts on the north quarter," he said. "The break pattern, you know it wasn't weather." "I know. Breck's man, or someone he hired, is not done. They'll come back, probably for the field next." "I know that too," she said. She met his eyes without flinching. "I have a plan for that as well." He went out into the morning and rode north, and he spent the rest of that day and most of the next one not thinking about Gideon Walsh at all. He presented himself to Walsh eventually, because he was not a man who broke his word even to someone he had not yet fully committed to. He worked Walsh's North Range for 2 weeks, fixing stock fences and moving cattle, doing the honest physical work that needed doing, and he listened to Walsh's talk about the county and Breck's plans and the way things were arranged. Walsh was not a bad man, which complicated things. He was simply a man who had made practical accommodations to power and had stopped questioning whether those accommodations were just. He mentioned Letitia Reed twice, once as that hard-headed widow on the South Claim, and once as a problem that would likely solve itself. Clark said nothing to either comment, but he was paying attention. On the 15th day, after the supper he ate with Walsh's small crew in the bunkhouse, he rode south. It was full dark when he crossed the creek and came up the back trail to Letitia's homestead. He saw the lamp in the cabin window, which meant she was still awake, which was not surprising given that it was barely 9 o'clock and she seemed to him like a woman who kept long hours. He tied his horse at the post and knocked, and she answered after a moment's pause that he suspected involved a hand near something she could use as a weapon. She opened the door and looked at him without surprise. "I expected you sooner," she said. "I had to settle some things. Walsh. I'm done with Walsh." She stepped back to let him in. There was paper spread across the table, and he saw immediately that it was not the survey map but legal documents, the kind with small print and official stamps. She had been working through them with her pencil, making notes in the margin. "What is that?" he said. "The text of the Homestead Act of 1862, the Kansas Land Filing Regulations of 1867, and a copy of a Federal Land Office circular from 1874 regarding duplicate filings in cases of contested claims." She sat down and picked up her pencil. "I've been corresponding with a lawyer in Topeka. He confirmed what I suspected. A claimant can file a sworn duplicate of a homestead claim in an adjacent county as a protective measure against local corruption of records. It is not commonly done, because most claimants are not aware it is possible." Clark sat down across from her. "You're going to file in another county." "I already filed in Morris County 2 days ago," she said. "I rode there myself. I have a receipt." She produced it from the stack of papers. "I am going to file a 3rd copy in Pawnee County next week, and I am going to send a notarized duplicate to the Federal Land Office in Topeka." She looked at him with that level, assessing gaze. "Breck can corrupt Culver. He cannot corrupt 4 registrars and a federal office simultaneously without exposure that would destroy him." Clark Trask sat very still for a moment. He had been in a lot of rooms with a lot of people in his 31 years. He had dealt with rangers and outlaws and lawyers and judges and cattle barons. He had known smart men and cunning men and men who were dangerous in the way that a loaded gun left in a saddlebag is dangerous, not because it intends harm, but because it is primed for it. He had not, in his experience, encountered anyone who had worked through a problem with this degree of systematic thoroughness. The strategy she had laid out was not simply clever. It was elegant in the way that the best solutions to complicated problems are elegant. It used the existing structure of the law as the tool, it created redundancy against corruption, and it neutralized Breck's greatest advantage, his control of local institutions, by moving the contest to a level where that local control was irrelevant. He realized he was staring. "It's a good plan," he said, and the inadequacy of that description was apparent to both of them. She set down her pencil. "You think it will work?" "I think it is the smartest approach to this problem that I have heard of or could have imagined," he said, and he said it plainly because it was true and because she was not a person you offered half-truths to. "It's better than anything a lawyer would have told you to do." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "My father used to say that the law is a landscape. You can read it if you learn its features. Most people never bother." A pause. "He was a good man. He just could not stay sober long enough to build a practice." There was no self-pity in it. It was simply a fact she had made her peace with. "I'm sorry," Clark said. "He died well," she said. "He was surveying a creek claim for a family out near Dodge City. The creek flooded. He saved the family's youngest boy. He did not save himself." She looked at the window for a moment. "It was like him. He was better to other people than he was to himself." The lamplight was warm and the wind outside was carrying the smell of rain coming, and Clark Trask was aware of something shifting in the quality of the room, a change in the specific gravity of the air between them, and he was aware that it was dangerous and interesting in equal measure. "What do you need from me?" he said, because that was the safer question, and also because it was the real question. She looked at him. "Two things. I need to ride to Pawnee County next week, and I need a man who can watch this place while I'm gone. Breck's people will move on the south field if I leave it unattended for 3 days. What's the second thing? The night before last, someone cut the lock on my root cellar and went through my records. I have copies of my original survey stored in an oilskin case under the floor planks in the cellar. They did not find those copies, because the case is not where a casual searcher would look. But they know I have survey records, and the next attempt will be more thorough." She met his eyes steadily. "I need someone who can move the copies to a safer location, and who can do it in a way that leaves no trail." "Where did you have in mind?" she told him, and it was, again, not the answer he expected, and it was, again, exactly right. For the next 2 weeks, Clark Trask lived in a state of constant alertness that was not entirely explained by the professional seriousness of the situation. He moved Letitia's survey records to the location she had identified, the stone foundation of a ruined mission building 3 miles south, accessible through a dry creek bed that was invisible from the road, where she had already cached a waterproof tin box. He spent 3 nights watching the south field from a position in the willow breaks along the creek, and on the second night he saw 2 men from Breck's employ approach the field with tools that were clearly not meant for legitimate agricultural purposes. He persuaded them to leave without violence, though the persuasion involved his rifle and a specific tone of voice he had developed over years of work that required it. They went, and they did not come back. He suspected they told Breck that the widow had hired a dangerous man, which was partly true. During the days, when he was not watching or writing or working at the physical tasks that the homestead required, he often found himself inside the cabin or on the porch, and Letitia would be working at the table, and they would talk. They talked about the land and the law and the state of Kansas politics and the difficulty of maintaining a wheat crop in this climate. They talked about surveying, and she explained her instruments to him with a teacher's clarity and a scientist's precision, and he found that he was genuinely interested, which was not something he had expected to find. They talked about his years as a ranger, which he described in the careful, selective way of a man who is being honest about the general shape of things while protecting the specific details that are either too personal or too shameful to share casually. She did not press for the details. She seemed to understand, in the way that perceptive people understand, the geography of what was being kept back, and she respected it, which made him trust her with slightly more of it each time they spoke. She told him about her marriage. Her husband had been a man named Albert Reed, a farmer from Indiana who had come west with grand ideas about the frontier and who had not been equipped for the reality of it. She had loved him in the beginning for his enthusiasm and his optimism and the way he had wanted to build something from nothing. She had been 22 and he had been 26, and the West had seemed to both of them like a country of possibilities. He had died in the winter of '76. Influenza, which had moved through the county that season with brutal efficiency. He had been sick for 8 days, and she had nursed him through all 8 of them, and lost him on the 9th day of January when the temperature outside was 14 degrees below zero. She had buried him under the cottonwood tree at the east edge of the property, where she could see the grave from the kitchen window. She was 27 now. She had been alone for 2 years. She did not describe this as tragedy. She described it as the shape of her life, and she had fit herself to that shape the way you fit yourself to the landscape, not by pretending it is different from what it is, but by learning its features thoroughly enough to navigate it. Clark Trask listened to this and felt in the most private part of himself a recognition that he had not expected. He was also alone. He was alone in a different way, a more chosen way, a way that had its own defenses built into it. But underneath those defenses was the same fundamental fact. He was a man who had not allowed himself to build anything because he had not believed he would stay anywhere long enough to build. He had not yet quite articulated to himself why he was still here. On the morning that Letitia was to ride to Pawnee County to file the 3rd copy of her claim, she came out of the cabin in her dark green riding coat with her satchel on her shoulder and found Clark saddling his horse in the yard. "You don't need to come," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm coming anyway." She looked at him for a moment. "The field. Jeb Henderson's boy said he'd watch it for $2. I gave him 3 to make sure." He swung up into the saddle and looked down at her. 40 miles is a long ride alone with someone who might want to stop you from getting there. She considered this. Then she put her foot in the stirrup and mounted her bay horse with the ease of a woman who had been riding since before she could walk. "You'll need to keep up," she said. "I plan to make it there before dark." "I'll keep up," he said. They rode through the morning with the sky clear and the prairie wind at their backs, and the conversation moved between practical and personal in the way that long shared rides produce. The kind of intimacy that comes from hours side by side, where the rhythm of the horses does something to the usual guardedness between people. She told him about the surveying technique called triangulation, which she had mastered at 14, and which she had used to produce her original homestead survey with a precision that was, as far as she could tell, considerably better than the county standard surveys produced by the official surveyor, whose instruments were old and whose technique she had quietly evaluated as adequate but not excellent. He told her, more than he had told anyone in years, about his years before the Rangers, about a period of his life in his early 20s when he had ridden with men whose names he was still careful about speaking in counties where those names might be recognized. He was not proud of it. He had not been a killer, but he had been present at events that had made him one kind of person when he might have become a different kind, and the choice to become the different kind had been deliberate and costly, and he was still, a decade later, paying certain kinds of interest on it. Letitia listened to this without flinching, without judgment, but also without the cheap reassurance that he had occasionally received from people who wanted to make him feel better rather than hear him clearly. She said, after a silence, "A man who knows he made wrong choices and changed course is more trustworthy than a man who has never had to make that accounting." He looked at her. The afternoon sun was at an angle that lit her face in a way that did things to the quality of the air around her. "That's generous." "It's not generous," she said. It's precise. I don't deal in generosity when precision is available. A beat. Also, I have been alone on this homestead for 2 years, and I am an excellent judge of men's character by this point, and you are not a dangerous man in the way that Breck's men are dangerous. What way am I dangerous? She looked at the road ahead and did not answer immediately, and when she did answer her voice was very level, the way it was when she was saying something that cost her. The other way, she said. They arrived in the county seat of Pawnee County as the sun was setting, red and enormous over the flat horizon. Letitia presented herself at the land office, which was staffed at this hour by a deputy registrar who clearly wished he were somewhere else but who processed her paperwork correctly and completely under her patient, precise supervision. And she rode out of that office with a receipt that represented the third anchor of her legal strategy. And the whole thing was, Clark thought, one of the most satisfying things he had witnessed in a long time. They found a boarding house and took 2 rooms, because they were people who understood the importance of propriety in a territory where a woman's reputation was both more fragile and more consequential than a man's. But they sat on the porch of the boarding house until 10 o'clock that night talking about things that had nothing to do with Breck or land claims, talking about music, which she was fond of and he had opinions about, and books, and the question of whether the railroad's expansion into western Kansas would be good or bad for people like her, and the specific way the stars looked different here than they looked further south, which he had noticed, and which she had a theoretical explanation for involving atmospheric refraction that he did not entirely follow but found oddly riveting. When they said good night at their respective doors, they stood in the narrow hallway of the boarding house for a moment longer than necessary, the lamp at the end of the corridor painting everything in amber, and Clark Trask looked at Letitia Reed and thought, with the plainness that sometimes comes to a man when he has finally stopped lying to himself, that he was entirely, completely, and probably irreversibly interested in her. Not in the casual way he had been interested in women before. In the specific way that comes from sitting beside someone for 2 days and discovering that they are larger inside than you expected. He said good night. She said good night. He went into his room and lay on the bed with his hat over his face and did not sleep for a long time. The ride back the next morning was different from the ride there, not because anything had been said, but because things that have been understood do not ununderstand themselves, and both of them were carrying the weight of several understandings that neither had yet put into words. There was a specific quality to the silence between them now, thick with something that was not discomfort but was adjacent to it, the specific discomfort of a feeling that wants to be spoken and is being held back by caution. Halfway back, they stopped at a creek to water the horses, and Letitia knelt at the bank to check the water level against a stick mark she had apparently made on a previous visit, because she looked at the mark and made a note in her field book without any explanation, and Clark watched her do it and said, "What are you measuring?" "Creek flow," she said without looking up. "The creek that runs through the lower quarter of my land originates partly from this watershed. If the upper flow diminishes, my lower quarter loses significant water rights value, and Breck has been making inquiries about a diversion that would redirect this creek further north, onto Walsh's Range." She put the field book away and stood. "I have been documenting the baseline flow for 8 months. If he diverts, I will have proof of the before and after change, and documentation is the foundation of any successful legal challenge." Clark looked at her. The sun was straight overhead, and the creek sparkled, and she was standing with her field book in her hand and her hair coming loose again, and he thought that there was something profoundly beautiful about a person who understood their own world that thoroughly. Not beautiful in the way that beauty is usually deployed as a word, but beautiful in the way that a perfectly constructed argument is beautiful, or a well-built piece of machinery, beautiful because every part of it is exactly what it needs to be and nothing extra. He kissed her. It was not a plan. It was not a consideration. It was the result of standing close to someone for long enough that the remaining distance between them becomes simply unreasonable. He kissed her and she was still for one single second that lasted a long time, and then she kissed him back, and it was not a tentative thing. It had the same quality as everything she did. It was deliberate and thorough and completely itself. When they stepped apart, she looked at him with those dark eyes, and there was something in them that he had not seen before, a kind of vulnerability that she wore differently than most people wore vulnerability, not as fragility but as the specific courage it takes to let something matter. "That was not in the plan," she said. "No," he agreed. "I will need to think about it," she said. "All right," he said. He meant it. He was in no condition to rush anything, and he suspected that she would think about it with the same thoroughness she brought to everything, and that whatever conclusion she reached would be one that was worth waiting for. They rode the rest of the way home without discussing it, which was its own kind of intimacy. When they arrived back at the homestead, the south field was intact, and Jeb Henderson's boy was waiting on the porch with a perfectly straight face that suggested nothing untoward had occurred, which was a relief. Clark paid him and the boy rode off, and Letitia went into the cabin and came back out with a letter that had arrived in her absence by the hand of the county mail rider. Her face, as she read it, became very still. "What is it?" Clark said. She handed him the letter. It was from Culver, the registrar, and it was written in the careful, slightly elaborate style of a man who has learned to create ambiguity in written documents. It informed her, in terms that were technically neutral, that her original Harlan County filing was under review due to a question raised by a third-party survey regarding the accuracy of the metes and bounds description in the original claim. It requested her presence at the land office to respond to the challenge within 30 days, or the claim would be suspended pending review. "This is it," Letitia said. Her voice was entirely flat. "The legal challenge." He filed a counter-survey. "Can he do that?" "Anyone can file a survey challenge. The question is whether the challenger's survey is credible." She took the letter back. "Breck hired someone to produce a survey that contradicts mine. If my measurements were imprecise, his survey might be more accurate and the challenge could hold. If my measurements were precise, and they are, I can demonstrate that his survey is the inaccurate one." Looked at the letter for another moment. "But demonstrating it requires presenting my original survey instruments, my original field notes, and an expert testimony, in Harlan County, before Culver who Breck owns." "Yes," she folded the letter carefully, "which is why the other filings matter. But the challenge is in Harlan County, and if I lose at that level, even with the other filings, the process of appealing will take years and cost money I do not have." Clark thought about it. "Who did Breck hire for the counter-survey?" "The letter does not say." "I can find out," Clark said. "I know the county. I know who the working surveyors are." If Breck needed a man on short notice who would produce numbers to order, there are only 2 or 3 men in this part of the territory who would do that work and know enough to make it look legitimate. She looked at him. "If you find out who it is, I can examine his methodology. Every surveyor has technique signatures, ways they take their readings, how they handle the transit, how they record their chain measurements. If I can identify the specific ways this person works, I may be able to demonstrate in court that the counter-survey was not done in the field at all." He understood the implication. "You think Breck's man produced a desk survey?" "I think it is very possible," she said. "Producing a field survey that contradicts mine would require going to my land, taking measurements and coming up with different numbers. But if my original survey is as accurate as I know it to be, a competent field surveyor cannot produce legitimately different results. So to get different results, you would either have to be incompetent, or you would have to produce a survey you had not actually performed in the field. A forged survey. A survey produced without field verification," she said. "Which is not precisely forgery in the legal sense, but which can be demonstrated as fraudulent if you can show that the stated measurements cannot be reconciled with the actual physical terrain." She paused. "And I know the terrain of my land better than any man Breck hired on short notice." There it was again, that quality of mind. Clark felt it like something physical. He spent the next 3 days in town, at the Prairie Dog and at the feed store and at the blacksmith's, the places where men talked. He gathered what he needed in pieces. A name, a bar tab, a comment made over cards, an overheard argument between Breck's foreman and a man who was clearly expecting payment he had not received. The name was a man called Stokes, who had worked for the county surveyor's office 3 years ago before being let go for reasons that people described with euphemisms. Stokes was now in town and drinking on money he had recently come into, which told its own story. Clark found Stokes at the Prairie Dog on the third evening, in a condition that made the conversation easier than it might otherwise have been. He did not threaten. He simply sat down and explained, in very specific terms, what he knew and what he was prepared to do with it. And Stokes, who was not a brave man and who had the self-preservation instincts of someone who has been in trouble before, told him considerably more than Clark had expected. The counter-survey was indeed fraudulent. Stokes had never set foot on Letitia Reed's land. He had produced measurements based on a general county plat map and some estimates, adjusted to create a discrepancy with her original filing. The measurements were internally inconsistent in ways he had hoped would not be noticed, because he was not actually good at the technical aspects of the work, only at the willingness to do it. He had been paid $50. He had not been told that the woman he was contradicting was a trained surveyor. Clark came back to the homestead that night and told Letitia everything. She was very quiet for a long moment. Then she went to the wall map and looked at it, and Clark watched her thinking, which was a specific visible process in her, the slight movement of her lips that meant she was working through calculations, the way her right hand moved slightly as though she were writing in the air. Then she turned around. "I need 3 things," she said. "I need his original field notes, which he will have had to submit to Culver's office as part of the challenge filing. Those notes will have the internal inconsistencies. I need a copy of the county plat map from 1875, which is what he would have used as his reference. And I need the hearing before Culver to be attended by someone from the federal land office in Topeka, so that whatever Culver decides, the decision is on record at the federal level. Can you get someone from Topeka? I have been writing to a man at the federal land office for 2 months, she said. His name is Aldrich. He is sympathetic to claims involving local corruption. If I write him tonight and explain the situation, and if the letter reaches him within the week, he may send a representative. Tonight's mail rider left at 4, Clark said. I know, she said. I will ride to the post station tonight and pay for a private courier. She was already at the table writing. Clark stood in the room and felt the specific helplessness and admiration of a person watching someone else do something they cannot contribute to, something that requires expertise he does not have. Then he sat down and began oiling his rifle, because he was a man who understood that the situations produced by confrontations with power required, at minimum, that your equipment be in good working order. She finished the letter in 20 minutes. She sealed it and put on her coat and was at the door before he was out of his chair. I'll ride with you, he said. It's 9 miles, she said. I know, he said. I'll ride with you. She looked at him with an expression that took something apart in him quietly and efficiently. All right, she said. They rode to the post station under stars so thick they seemed structural, like the sky was braced with them. The night smelled like new grass and distant rain. The courier, who was a young man of about 20 and who was very used to being woken up with money, agreed to ride for Topeka in the morning on the early route, and Letitia paid him from a leather purse that Clark suspected did not have a great deal in it beyond what she had paid him. On the ride back, they spoke quietly about the hearing and what she would need to present and the way she intended to demonstrate the fraud in Stokes's work. She was precise and methodical and entirely focused, and Clark listened and asked the occasional question that turned out to be useful, and at one point she said, You think clearly, and he said, I'm trying to keep up," and she laughed. It was the first time he had heard her laugh fully, not the dry, almost humor she occasionally produced, but a real laugh, low and warm, and it did something to the quality of the night around them that he filed away carefully. He did not kiss her on the ride back. He thought about it. He thought she might have been aware that he was thinking about it. Nothing was said. They arrived back at the homestead at midnight and parted with a good night that carried more weight than those words usually hold. The response from the Federal Land Office arrived 12 days before the hearing. It was signed by a man named Deputy Commissioner Aldrich, and it stated, in formal language, that given the nature of the dispute and the federal interest in the proper administration of homestead claims, a representative of the office would attend the hearing as an observer. Letitia read this letter twice, then set it down on the table and pressed her hands flat against the surface in a gesture that might have been prayer or might have been simply the need to feel something solid. Clark, who was on the porch reading Walsh's cattle records that he had borrowed for reasons that were not entirely legitimate, looked up through the window and saw her face and came inside without being asked. She looked at him. Her eyes were bright with something that was not quite tears, more like the concentrated feeling that produces tears and then overrides them. "It is going to work," she said. "I think it is actually going to work." He crossed the room and put his hands on her shoulders, which was the most he had permitted himself in the 3 weeks since the creek, and the contact was warm and solid and real. "Yes," he said, "it is." She looked up at him, and there was a long moment in which the several things they had been not quite saying to each other pressed against the underside of the ordinary conversation that was possible, and then she said, "I am not a woman who does things halfway." "I know," he said. "I am not a woman who would enter into something casually when we are sharing a living situation and a professional partnership, and when there is a legal crisis in progress." "That's reasonable," he said. "But I am also not a woman who pretends not to feel what she feels," she said, "and I think you should know that what I feel in terms of what has been happening between us is not a casual thing, a pause that had architecture, for me." "It's not casual for me either," he said. "There's nothing casual about any of this." She was quiet. Then she did something that surprised him, which was that she stepped forward and leaned her head against his chest for a moment. Just a moment, with the precise quality of someone who has made a deliberate decision to allow a vulnerability that they do not permit themselves often. He put his arms around her, and they stood like that in the middle of the cabin with the spring sun coming through the east window, and the whole complicated situation of their lives arranged around them. Then she stepped back. "We should prepare for the hearing," she said, and her voice was entirely normal, and he understood that they were both people who understood the difference between what the moment asked for and what the larger situation required. They prepared for the hearing with the thoroughness she brought to everything. She spent 4 days going over Stokes's filed survey notes, which she obtained through a formally worded written request to Culver's office citing her right as the challenged party to examine the challenging documentation. Culver had clearly not expected this request, and had clearly not known how to refuse it without producing a paper trail of refusal, so he provided the notes. She went through them at the table with her transit and field book open beside her, and she found, as she had predicted, the inconsistencies. She created a presentation. This was not a word that existed in common use in 1878 in the way it exists now, but the concept was hers, a systematic, point-by-point comparison of Stokes's stated measurements against what the physical terrain of her land made impossible. She used her own survey instruments to demonstrate, at 3 specific points, how a reading taken correctly from the terrain would differ from what Stokes had written. She drew diagrams. She cross-referenced with the county plat map. She prepared, in essence, what a lawyer would have prepared with 3 times the budget and twice the staff. And she did it in 4 days, largely between the hours of 4 in the morning and 9 at night. Clark watched her work and fixed the fence and checked the south field and brought food that he cooked in the outdoor kitchen with varying degrees of success. and each time she surfaced from the work he was there with something practical and useful, and occasionally something that made her laugh. And he was aware that this was a kind of love, this specific form of it, the love that consists of being useful and present to a person who does not need you but who is better with you there. He also wrote 2 letters of his own. One to a former ranger colleague in Topeka, asking about Breck's background and legal history, specifically anything that federal officials might find interesting. The other to the editor of the Topeka Daily Capital, described by his correspondent as a man of journalistic integrity who was actively looking for stories about frontier corruption. He said nothing to Letitia about either letter. He was planting seeds in soil he was not certain would be fertile, and he did not want to raise expectations that might not be fulfilled. The day of the hearing arrived with a morning that was gray and close, the sky pressing down on the flat land in a way that suggested serious weather was considering its options. They rode to town together, Letitia with her satchel of documents and instruments, Clark with his rifle and his specific quality of alertness. The land office building was a 2-story frame structure on Harlan County's Main Street, and when they arrived, there was a small crowd outside, because word had gotten around, in the way that things get around in small communities, that something significant was happening. Amos Breck was there. He was sitting in a chair that had been brought from somewhere specifically for him, because Breck was a man for whom chairs materialized when required. He was wearing good clothes and a satisfied expression, and when Letitia came up the street on her bay horse, his expression did not change, which told Clark that Breck had not yet understood what was about to happen to him. And behind Letitia, back at the doorway, was Clark Trask watching. What happened inside the Harlan County Land Office over the next 3 hours was something that several people who were present would describe for years afterward, each describing it slightly differently, but all agreeing on the central fact. A woman who had been expected to be outmaneuvered and defeated went into that room with a satchel of papers and a set of surveying instruments, and proceeded to dismantle a fraudulent counter-survey with the methodical precision of someone taking apart a watch. Culver tried twice to redirect the proceedings. Letitia redirected them back, citing specific sections of the land office regulations that governed hearing procedure, which she appeared to have memorized. The representative from the federal land office, a young man named Morris who had arrived the previous day and who clearly had not expected the level of technical sophistication on display, was taking notes with increasing rapidity. She set up her transit instrument on the table and demonstrated, using the county plat map, 3 separate instances where Stokes's stated measurements produced a terrain profile that was physically impossible. She produced the calculations calmly and walked through each one in terms plain enough that the room could follow. She produced her original field notes, dated 3 years before Stokes had filed his challenge, showing the same measurements she was citing now, consistent to within half a chain across the entire proving. She called Stokes. He was present, having been required to attend as the challenger. He looked, Clark thought, like a man who was trying to be somewhere else without physically moving. Under Letitia's questioning, which she conducted herself, in the absence of any lawyer and with no more authority than the right granted by procedure to the challenged party, Stokes was unable to answer 3 specific questions about readings that would have been taken in the field. He could not describe the terrain at 2 points on her land because he had never been there. He could not explain why his chain measurements at the north boundary were internally inconsistent because he had estimated them from the plat rather than measuring them. When Stokes fell silent for the 3rd time, the room was very quiet. Culver's face had gone through several colors. Breck, who had eventually come inside and was sitting at the back of the room, had a new expression, one that Clark recognized. It was the expression of a man who has been in control of something and has just felt it stop being true. Letitia turned to Morris from the federal land office. "I would like the record to reflect," she said, in the same steady voice she had used throughout, That the challenging survey has been demonstrated to be inconsistent with the physical terrain in 3 specific ways that are not accountable by measurement error or instrument variance, and that the challenger was unable to answer basic questions regarding field conditions that a surveyor present at the claimed location would have been able to answer without difficulty. I would further like the record to reflect that my original filing, which I have demonstrated to be internally consistent and consistent with the actual terrain, is supported by duplicate filings in Morris County, Pawnee County, and the Federal Land Office in Topeka, and that all 3 duplicates are dated prior to the challenge filing, establishing clear precedents. She closed her field book. I believe, she said, that the record is complete. Morris from the Federal Land Office had stopped taking notes. He was looking at her with the expression of someone who has just witnessed something they had not anticipated, and that expression was respect. Clear, uncomplicated professional respect. Clark Trask, standing in the doorway, felt something happen in his chest that was large and warm and entirely beyond his ability to manage. Culver dismissed the challenge. He did it in the careful language of a man who is simultaneously trying to cover himself and trying to get out of a room as quickly as possible, but he dismissed it, and Morris made a note in his federal record, and the challenge was over. Breck stood up. He looked at Letitia with the expression of a man who has not yet accepted the reality that has been presented to him, the expression of a man for whom this outcome was not supposed to be possible. Letitia looked at him with entirely level eyes. "Good day, Mr. Breck," she said. He left. His men followed him. The room began to breathe again. Morris shook Letitia's hand and said things that Clark did not hear because he was watching her face, watching the steadiness she had maintained through the entire morning finally soften, just slightly, at the edges, the way ice on a creek softens in the first warm week of spring, not breaking but changing, becoming something that was still strong but was also, finally, allowed to be a little tired. Clark crossed the room and stood beside her, and she looked up at him, and he said, very quietly, "You were extraordinary." She looked at him for a moment. Her voice was equally quiet. "I was prepared," she said, "which is the same thing." He shook his head. "Not the same thing," he said, "not by a long way." They walked out of the land office into the street, which had been raining while they were inside. The street was wet and the air smelled like clean earth, and the sky was moving, breaking up, the first patches of blue appearing in the gray. A few people who had been watching came forward to shake Letitia's hand, neighbors and homesteaders, and one woman from the mill, who had apparently been following the situation, and who was openly weeping with a feeling that had nothing to do with Letitia personally, and everything to do with the recognition of something that felt like justice. Letitia shook hands and accepted words and kept her composure. Clark stood slightly behind and to her right, not because she needed protecting, she had demonstrated comprehensively that she did not, but because he was where he wanted to be. That evening, the letter Clark had written to his ranger colleague in Topeka produced its first result. A messenger arrived at the homestead with a response that included a document, obtained through official channels, detailing Amos Breck's previous land dealings in 2 other Kansas counties, both of which involved challenges to homestead claims that had resulted in the claimants abandoning their properties. Both cases were documented. Neither had been prosecuted. The document from Topeka suggested that, in light of the events of the day's hearing, the circumstances of both previous cases might merit review by federal authorities. Clark read this document and took it to Letitia and watched her read it. "This is enough," she said, "to warrant a federal investigation." "I thought so," he said. She looked up from the document. "You wrote to someone, a colleague from the Rangers. He works in the federal marshal's office now." She was quiet for a moment. "You did this while we were preparing for the hearing." "Yes. You did not tell me. I didn't want to raise expectations if it came to nothing." She looked at him for a long moment with the assessing look, and then something behind it that was warmer and more complicated. "You were watching out for me," she said, not a question. "Yes," he said, "I was." She stood and went to the window and looked out at the evening. The cottonwood tree at the east edge was just leafing out, and the grave under it was visible as a slight depression in the ground, nearly invisible now, returned almost entirely to the landscape. She stood there for a moment and then she turned back. "Clark," she said. "Yes," he said. "I have been thinking," she said, "about what I said before, about not doing things halfway." "I remember," he said. "I do not want you to leave," she said. "And I recognize that is a considerable thing to say to a man who has not indicated whether he intends to stay." She paused. "So I am asking you to indicate." He got up from the table and crossed the room and stood in front of her, and he was aware of the gravity of what she was asking and the gravity of his own answer and the fact that this was not a casual moment in a casual life. "I have not had a home in a long time," he said. "I did not believe I was looking for one." He looked at her. "I think I have found one regardless. I think that's what this past month has been." He reached out and took one of her hands and held it, and the contact was simple and real. "I don't intend to leave." She looked at him with the full weight of her intelligence and her independence and her particular hard-won self-possession, and something in it opened. "Good," she said. Her voice was low and entirely itself. "Then stay." He stayed. The months that followed were the best months of Clark Trask's life, which was a thing he was aware of even as they were happening, because he had learned early that good things were worth naming while you had them. He worked the homestead with Letitia, and the work was the kind that reveals character in full, because there is nothing abstract about breaking ground and fixing fences and cutting wood and nursing a wheat crop through the variable moods of Kansas weather. He discovered that she was a precise and efficient partner in all of it, applying the same systematic approach to farm work as to surveying and legal preparation, and that she was also, beneath the precision, playful in ways he had not expected, quick to laugh at the small disasters that frontier life produces, the fence post that went in crooked after 2 hours of effort, the loaf of bread that emerged from the outdoor oven as something that was technically edible but suggested he should not attempt bread again without supervision. She supervised him. He did not mind. He was, in fact, transparently delighted by it. They were married in August of that year, 1878, at the church in town, which was a frame building with good windows and a minister who had come west from Kentucky, and who conducted the ceremony with a warmth that felt genuine rather than professional. Letitia wore a dress of dark blue wool that she had made herself over the previous 2 weeks, working in the early morning before the day's heat built up. It was beautifully made, precisely fitted, and she wore it with the same self-possession she wore everything. Clark wore his good coat, which he had sent to be cleaned in Topeka, and he stood at the front of the church and watched her come up the aisle and thought that the word beautiful was insufficient but was all that was available. Jeb Henderson's family was there. Morris from the Federal Land Office had made the trip from Topeka, which was not required of him, and which was the kind of gesture that meant something. A few of the neighboring homesteaders came, people who had watched the events of the hearing with the interest of people who understood they had stakes in what happened to the small claims in the county. Even a woman named Alma Pierce, who ran the boarding house and who had been skeptical of Letitia in the early years, came and cried, which surprised everyone including Alma. Amos Breck was not there. He was, by August, under federal investigation for land fraud in 3 counties, and though the investigation would take another 1.5 years to complete, it had the immediate effect of making him considerably less certain about the impunity with which he had previously operated. He was not in jail yet. But the quality of his certainty had changed, and that change was visible to everyone in the county who paid attention. They came home to the homestead that evening, and the cabin was the same as it had always been, solid and well-built and entirely hers, and now, by formal and felt measure, theirs. She had put wildflowers in a jar on the table, the only decorative gesture she had made toward the occasion, and the jar sat on the table with the survey map on the wall behind it, and the surveying instruments on the shelf and the annotated copy of the Homestead Act, and Clark looked at all of it and felt the specific happiness of a man who is exactly where he should be and knows it. "Mrs. Trask," he said, which was the first time he had used that name. She looked at him over her shoulder with an expression that was complex and warm and faintly amused. "Letitia Reed Trask," she said. "I am keeping the Reed." "Of course," he said. "The survey records are all filed under Reed," she said. "It would be unnecessarily complicated to change them." "Entirely practical," he said. "Yes," she said. And then she smiled at him properly, fully, the smile that he had been collecting like evidence since the first time he saw it, the smile that was not offered casually, and that was, every time, worth waiting for. The winter of 1878 into 1879 was cold and long, and they spent it exactly as people spent winters on frontier homesteads, repairing equipment, preserving food, reading by lamplight, talking. They talked about everything. She taught him more about surveying, enough that he could assist her competently in the field, and she pronounced him, after 3 months of instruction, adequate, which from me means quite good. He taught her to shoot with the kind of accuracy that the frontier sometimes required, which she had been perfectly capable of learning from anyone, but had simply not had the right teacher, and she went from adequate to precise in under a month. He was not surprised. In February, she told him, she was pregnant with a measured quietness that contained, beneath the measure, something enormous and barely contained. He crossed the kitchen and held her for a long time, and neither of them said anything that was expressible in words. The baby, a boy they named Franklin Reed Trask, arrived in October of 1879, during a stretch of weather that was unusually warm and golden for that time of year, as though the season were making a specific gesture. He was healthy and loud, and had his mother's eyes, dark and observant, and Clark held him on the first evening, and felt the full weight of what it means to be responsible for a life in a way that is different from all other forms of responsibility. Letitia recovered quickly, because she was constitutionally incapable of doing otherwise, and because she had prepared for the recovery with the same thoroughness she brought to everything, including a specific diet she had read about in a medical journal she had ordered from Philadelphia, and a set of exercises she was doing by the third day that alarmed their neighbor Mrs. Henderson, who came to help and who was sent home sooner than she expected because the situation was well in hand. March 14, 1880 was Letitia's proving-up date, the 5 years required by the Homestead Act. She rode to the Harlan County Land Office herself, though Clark rode beside her. Culver was no longer the registrar. He had resigned the previous fall under circumstances that were related to the Breck investigation and that he had chosen not to contest publicly. The new registrar was a young woman named Grace Hollister, who had been appointed by the county commissioners after a protracted argument in which 2 of the 3 commissioners, both of whom had owed significant favors to Breck, had been replaced by men elected by homesteaders and small farmers who had paid attention to the events of the previous 2 years. Grace Hollister processed Letitia's proving-up documents with professional competence and something approaching reverence, because she knew the story, everyone in the county knew the story, and she stamped the patent and signed the register and handed Letitia the document that said, in the plain language of the federal government, that the land was hers. Legally, permanently, irrevocably hers. Letitia held the patent and looked at it for a moment. She did not cry. She was not a person who cried easily, and in any case the moment was too large for tears, too long anticipated, too hard won. She simply held it with both hands and read it once completely, the way she read everything, and then she folded it precisely and put it in her satchel. She looked at Clark. "It's done," she said. He put his arm around her shoulders right there in the land office, which was not the done thing in 1880 in a public building in Kansas, but which was what he did. "It's done," he agreed. She leaned into him for 1 second. Then she was upright again, her satchel on her shoulder, her chin up herself. "Franklin will need feeding when we get home," she said, Mrs. Henderson has been watching him for 2 hours. Then we should ride, he said. They rode home. The Breck investigation concluded in the spring of 1881. Amos Breck was found guilty of fraudulent interference with homestead claims in 3 counties, which the federal prosecutor framed as a pattern of corruption that had deprived multiple families of legally valid land rights. He received a sentence that required him to make restitution to the families whose claims had been driven out, and while he was not imprisoned, the fine and the restitution and the public humiliation of the verdict effectively ended his influence in the county. He moved his operations south, into Indian Territory, where the legal environment suited him better, and Harlan County breathed differently in his absence. 2 of the families whose claims Breck had driven out were located. 1. A family named Pryor who had abandoned their claim in 1876, came back to the county in the fall of 1881 and found their original land still available for refiling. Letitia helped them with the survey work, refusing payment, saying only that she had not forgotten what it was to be in a contested position with no one who knew how to help. The summer of 1882 brought a second pregnancy, and this time the summer was dry and demanding, and Clark ran the homestead largely by himself during the worst of the heat, managing the wheat and the garden and the small herd of cattle they had built up over the previous 4 years. Letitia worked through the pregnancy with what Mrs. Henderson called stubborn determination and what Clark called, privately, her completely predictable competence. She was surveying a neighbor's claim for pay in June and drafting a letter to the Kansas Farmers Advocate about water rights in August and canning tomatoes in September. The second baby came in October again, which made Letitia observe that she seemed to have a pattern, and which produced a girl named Clara Josephine Trask, who had her father's blue eyes and her mother's manner of examining things carefully before making a judgment about them. Franklin, who was 2.5 and very certain about his opinions, inspected his sister with the expression of a young man who is reserving judgment, then patted her head with a careful hand, which was as good a welcome as could be expected. In the winter evenings, after the children were in the sleeping loft and the lamp was turned down and the fire was settled into its low nighttime burn, Clark and Letitia would sit at the table together. Sometimes she would be working, letters or calculations or the ongoing informal legal advice she had begun providing to other homesteaders in the county, because word had gotten around about what she had done, and people came to ask her questions she could usually answer. Sometimes he would be reading. He had become a more serious reader over the past 4 years, influenced by her habit of it and by her willingness to argue about whatever either of them was reading, with an enthusiasm that made the arguments pleasurable. Sometimes they sat in silence, the companionable silence of people who are so accustomed to each other's presence that silence requires no maintenance. He would look at her in those moments, the lamplight on her face, the fine lines at the corners of her eyes that had arrived in the past year, the gray beginning at her temples that she had noted with interest and zero concern. He would think about the ridge above the North Quarter, 3.5 years ago, watching a woman he had not yet met examine a broken fence with her knees in the mud. He would think about the creek and the starlight and the boarding house in Pawnee County and the land office and everything that had come after. He said to her once, in one of those winter evenings, "I spent 10 years not knowing what I was looking for." She looked up from her letters. And now I think it was this," he said, "this specific thing." She looked at him with the full, clear gaze that he had never stopped finding remarkable. "You would have found something," she said. "You are a man who builds things when given the materials." "You gave me the materials," he said. She shook her head slightly. "You chose to come down from the ridge," she said. "That was yours." He thought about it. "All right," he said. "I choose it again." She smiled, the full one, the one he had been collecting. "So do I," she said. The homestead grew. They added a proper barn in the summer of 1883, with the help of 3 neighboring families, who turned the barn raising into a two-day occasion, with more food than Clark had seen outside of a hotel dining room. Letitia contributed 3 pies and a systematic critique of the original roof design that resulted in a significantly better roof, which no one complained about. They expanded the wheat acreage in 1884, hiring 2 hands for the harvest season, young men from Missouri who were strong workers and who were politely terrified of Mrs. Trask's ability to identify exactly what they had done wrong before they had finished explaining what they had done. Clark built a lean-to addition on the east side of the cabin that became a proper room, with a window that looked out at the cottonwood tree and the grave beneath it, and Letitia arranged her surveying instruments and her books and her map collection in this room, and it became the room where people came when they had questions about land, which they came to do with increasing frequency as her reputation spread. She did not call it an office. She called it the working room, which was what it was. In 1885, the Kansas legislature passed a new set of regulations regarding the precedence of water rights in contested creek claims, and the language of the regulations bore a notable resemblance to a letter that Letitia Reed Trask had submitted to the state land commissioner the previous year. Clark found this letter reproduced in the Kansas Farmer's Advocate alongside an article about the regulation, and he brought the paper to her and pointed to her name in the byline of the quoted letter and said nothing, because there was nothing that needed to be said. She read it and set the paper down and said, "The language in the 3rd clause is weaker than I would have written it." He laughed, which made Franklin, who was 6 and sitting at the table with his schoolbook, look up and grin, because Franklin had determined that his father's laughter was a good sign about how the day was going. Franklin started school that fall, riding the 2 miles to the schoolhouse in town on a pony that Clark had bought from a man in Morris County, and that Franklin named General, for reasons he could not fully explain but was very firm about. Clara, who was 3, informed everyone that she wanted to go to school too and was told to wait, and accepted this with the expression of a person who is waiting under protest. In the working room that winter, Letitia was drafting a comprehensive guide to the homestead filing process in Kansas, aimed at new claimants who were not lawyers and who could not afford to be, drawing on her own experience and the experience of the dozens of people she had advised over the previous 7 years. It was a practical document, methodical and clear, and annotated with specific references to the regulations. She was planning to send it to the Kansas Farmer's Advocate in installments. Clark read the first installment when it was finished and said, "This is the best thing I have read about the homestead laws, including things written by lawyers." "Lawyers write for other lawyers," she said. "I am writing for farmers." "You should put your name on it," he said. "Your full name so people know who wrote it." She looked at him. "People will discount it if they know a woman wrote it." "Some people," he said. "The people who won't discount it are the people who need it most, and in 10 years fewer people will discount it. You should put your name on it." She thought about this for a moment. Then she picked up her pen and wrote at the top of the first page, "By Letitia Reed Trask, Homesteader, Harlan County, Kansas. Established March 14, 1875. She sent it to the Advocate in January of 1886. The editor ran it in 4 installments. The response was larger than anyone expected, including the editor. Letters came from homesteaders across 3 states. 2 came from women who said that reading it had convinced them they could file claims they had been afraid to file. 1 came from a lawyer in Wichita who asked if she would be willing to consult on a case involving a disputed water claim at a professional fee. She consulted. She was correct about the water claim. She was paid. On a morning in April of 1886, 11 years into the life that had begun in the mud beside a broken fence, Letitia stood at the east window of the working room and looked out at the property. The wheat was coming up in the south field, a particular green that was the green of the Kansas spring, and that never looked the same twice. The barn was visible past the corner of the cabin. The cottonwood tree at the east edge had grown considerably over the decade, and the grave beneath it was fully absorbed into the root system now, part of the land in the most literal way. Clark came up behind her and put his hands on her shoulders, and she leaned back against him in the way she had learned over years to do, the way that is the specific physical language of two people who have built a life together and who know the shape of each other in the deep, cellular way of people who have been through hard things side by side and come out the other side. "Franklin is asking about the North Quarter," he said. "He wants to know if we're going to put cattle or wheat there this season." "He's 7, she said. "He's thorough," Clark said. "Like his mother," she smiled. "Cattle," she said. "The soil drainage on the North Quarter is better suited to pasture than wheat, and we need the capacity to expand the herd. I have been thinking about it since winter. Should I tell him that? Tell him I'll explain the drainage analysis at dinner," she said. "He should understand the reasoning." Clark pressed a kiss to the back of her head. "He's going to be a remarkable person." "So is Clara," she said. "She figured out yesterday that my transit instrument measures angles. She is trying to figure out how. I'm going to show her after school." Outside, the morning wind moved through the wheat in that way it had, the way that sounded like a conversation too distant to hear. The land lay around them in every direction, 160 acres of legal, permanent, federal patent homestead, proven and held and earned, the earth and the work and the years all of one piece. Letitia Reed Trask turned away from the window and picked up her field book from the desk. "I need to run a baseline on the east fence this morning," she said. "It needs to be resurveyed before we expand the pasture." "I'll come with you," Clark said. "You'll need to keep up," she said. It was what she had said the first time they rode together, the first morning of 40 miles and everything that came after. He put on his hat. "I'll keep up," he said. It was what he had said then. She went out the door and he followed her into the morning, and the Kansas sky was the color of something you could live your entire life inside of, and the land that was there stretched out around them in every direction, lawful and permanent and real. The fence line would be surveyed. The measurements would be precise. The calculations would be exactly right. And the man who had come down from the ridge, that first cold spring morning because a woman in the mud had made him want to be part of whatever she was doing, walked beside her into the bright, ordinary, extraordinary morning of their life. It was enough. It was, in every way that the word can mean, more than enough.